Since suburbanization became a major form of city expansion in the US, the amount of vehicle usage has skyrocketed. Though not an inherently bad thing, cities are now designed for vehicles. Highways were created for people to easily transport themselves across the country, something lots of people have utilized. A large chunk of the population can now live comfortably in a large single-family home and own a car, an idea that has become a norm in most cities, but not all. A lot of more historic cities in the US were already designed in a way that doesn't allow widespread car ownership. Streets could be too thin, roads could be designed in a way that makes traffic impossible, or it could just be too dense for all that parking. This usually does come in some of the oldest cities in the country, so today I want to go over the US cities that top this list, going by car ownership percent and talking about why they are the way that they are, and how this affects the city. Before we get into that though, make sure you do subscribe to the channel. We make geography content like this every week, so if you want to keep updated with my channel and see every upcoming video about topics like this, click that subscribe button below. I really appreciate it. Thank you. So today we'll be going over the top 7 cities for this category. One main limitation is that only the top city in this category from each metropolitan area will be included. There were a couple metro areas that dominated the top of the list, so instead we'll limit it to see the different regions that excel here. So getting into our top 7, let's start with New Haven, Connecticut. So New Haven, much like the other cities we'll find on this list, is very historic and wasn't developed with cars in mind. Despite this, freeways were built through the city in the 1900s. In fact, I-95 and I-91 meet at a large interchange near the downtown. So you'd think it would end up having a lot of vehicles, right? Well, not so much. Some of you may know that New Haven is the home of Yale University, and the college is a big part of the city culturally and demographically. This is a big part of why it's on the list, with a 70.8 vehicle ownership percent, which equates to 1.1 cars per household. This is still a very high amount, which shows you around where the country is at for car ownership. But if we were to go to the other side of the list, some cities get as high as 2.36 cars per household, so it could be higher. Moving on, next we have a bit larger city that more people would care about, which would be Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So Philadelphia has a very diverse and lengthy history, being one of the country's most influential cities. It was designed by William Penn in 1682 with the downtown grid design that we see today. Now, despite grid designs being sometimes associated with cars, obviously this was designed early enough that streets are very thin, and they weren't built for wide cars. There wasn't parking designed into the downtown, and the developments are so dense that, to put it simply, it's not viable for everyone to own a vehicle. This has turned into a 70.5% vehicle ownership, with an average of 1.05 vehicles per household. These percentages likely end up kind of centering in the outer parts of town. If you think about the row home design that is seen in most of the city, you can barely fit one car in front of each row home around the downtown, which isn't thinking about other vehicles that might find their way to that part of the street to be parked, as well as roads where parking isn't allowed. One last interesting tidbit is that the median household income in Philadelphia is actually higher than New Haven, something I'd guess would have to do with the university again. Moving on to 5th place, we have one that people likely could have guessed, which is San Francisco, California. When talking about dense cities that are less car dependent in the country, one of the first cities most people would think of is San Francisco. Its reason for density isn't complicated. Being placed on a peninsula, the city simply ran out of room and was forced to make their current areas denser rather than expanding outwards like most cities would do right now. This resulted in a lot more people than the area could support for vehicles, so most people ended up having to find alternatives. The city ended up rejecting a plan that would have built several more freeways around the city, and though I don't think that this would have made it any more car dependent, it shows that the city almost rejected the idea of this form of travel being their main mode. So instead they have a vehicle ownership percent of 70.1, with an average of 1.1 vehicles per household. Moving on to 4th place, I'm thrown completely for a loop, because our next one is Hartford, Connecticut. Now this is obviously not the typical example we've seen on this list so far. Every other city had an obvious reason that was easy to describe, but Hartford is different. There are plenty of freeways and interstates in the city, with large interchanges right through the downtown, and most of the city's waterfront is taken up by I-91. It's not a viable option to commute to New York or Boston, so they're in a spot that feels almost isolated from the rest of New England. You'd think they'd have a higher car ownership, but no. One major reason would be public transportation options in Hartford. There have been improvements to this which has made it a more viable option. the city is also home to a high number of one-person households and younger families, which have a higher likelihood of not owning a car. Finally, people work for the state government, and they could easily stay and live within the downtown without owning a vehicle. But obviously that would also be seen in other state capitals, which are not on this list. Despite all these factors being shaky at best, Hartford has a car ownership percent of 67.4, with just 0.99 vehicles per household. Moving on, we scoot past Boston, because it's actually not the lowest percent in its metro area, which would instead be our third place, Cambridge, Massachusetts. Now, the Boston metropolitan area has always been very friendly for pedestrians and people who don't own vehicles. The city itself would have been on this list, with the whole region having a strong public transportation system. This also helps the city of Cambridge place very high on this list, but those are just some of the add-ons to the real reasons, which would be the city's 2 colleges. So the first is obviously Harvard, which is a large college that likely has a very low car ownership number. But MIT is also located there, which only lowers the percent of people that would own a car. Honestly, the car ownership percentage is higher than I would have guessed, at 63.2%, with 0.86 cars per household. I don't know where most of these people are fitting their cars, but I guess if you look at any residential street in the city, they're still covered in cars, showing that to be the main way people do end up owning cars. Moving into our top 2, we start with Washington, D.C. I see Washington, D.C. as culturally a very similar city to Boston in these aspects. It's dense, has a very strong public transportation system that's near the top of any city in the nation, it's walkable, and a few other factors. One other factor would be the amount of universities within the city, which relates to Cambridge. American University, George Washington University, Georgetown, and Howard are all major schools located within the city lines. Schools like this, especially in such a pedestrian-friendly city, are going to have low vehicle ownership. Another reason would be the high level of people employed by the government, which would make it very easy for them to just live downtown and either walk or take public transportation to their place of employment, which is centered around one small area. DC has a vehicle ownership percentage of 62.7%, with 0.86 cars per household. Finally, our first place city is no surprise, so I'll just get straight into it with New York City. Now, this city is known for its high-end subway and extremely dense nature. You can live basically anywhere in the city and easily use the subway for transportation around. Sure, some people want to travel to places outside of New York, and they would need a vehicle for that. But most of the residents easily get around using the diverse transportation options. I visited New York recently and had no trouble getting around just using the subway and walking. It was only for a day and we spent it mostly in Manhattan and the Bronx, but I had no trouble walking maybe a couple miles and taking the subway from stop to stop when necessary. The city was built for this and does it successfully. The car ownership percentage dips way down to 45.6%, with just 0.63 vehicles per household, a low number for this country. That's my list for today, though. I found it interesting just how high the rates are, even at the least car-dependent cities in the country. You'd think you could find 2 extremes, and cities that it's not really normalized to own a car. But it's also a very large country, and people want to easily get from city to city. So you have to understand the factors that play into this. We aren't living in the Netherlands. Things are different here. Thanks for watching. Thank you to the members this week: Brock Sanders, Stephen Priestman, SB Wilder, Florida Jake, Sir JC17, Alex Williams, Mikita Martinoff, Kurt Ainsley, Jerome McCall, KMS162, JL Bryson, Rosebud 4, Darkbird, Big Pasty, Wolfwing73, Snyder Schwein, Benjamin Whitings, Ryan Devins, and Haas of the Wolf. If you want to become a member, the link is down in the description below. All of this money will just go straight to me, so if you want to help me out as a person, that's the best way to do it. Thank you.